So welcome everyone to our May coffee chat. We will be talking about collection policies. I'm Laura Knudsen-Murray. I am the GIS coordinator and community outreach assistant for IrisBG. With us today is Shanna Jones. She's the social media and community outreach assistant for IrisBG. So the recording will be shared, and any of the resources that Laurel makes available to us will be shared in the Knowledge Library article. As with all of our previous coffee chats, they're found under the section Articles and Presentations. You can also follow this topic and be notified via email anytime something new is published. Again, these coffee chats are for you. The idea is that you would have a space to contact your peers and connect and chat about issues that come up with your collection work. We don't have a fixed format, so if there's a topic or a challenge that you would like to put out to the community, can be anything big or small, just let us know. Feel free to email me or Shanna. Hopefully we'll make some new connections today, and together we might grow a little bit wiser. Here's a map of everyone that registered. We are quite a few from the States, Europe, and even South Africa. So it's great to have so many people on the call. To get to know everyone a little bit more, let's launch a poll just to get to know everyone's experience with IrisBG. Are you a novice, intermediate? Do you consider yourself advanced, or are you just still trying out the trial? Great. So it looks like 43% are novice, 32 intermediate, 14 advanced, and a few of you trying out the trial. It's great. Thanks for answering that. It gives us an idea of who's on the call. Our presentation today will be given by Laurel Hill. She is the Plant Records Curator and Senior Horticulturalist at Lewis Ginter. She's giving a presentation on Grounded in Policy, Sowing the Seeds of Living Collections Management. And just a heads up, we won't have a coffee chat in June because we'll be at the APGA conference. But then in July, we're hoping to have more of a roundtable talking about herbarium collections. So watch for a link in our newsletter for that. Without further ado, I will give the presentation over to Laurel.
Thank you so much, Laura, and hello, everybody. It's great to see so many friendly faces and names that I recognize over my years learning about living collection management. I am really hopeful that we can have kind of an engaging back and forth talk, because I know that you all have something to teach us, so that I'm not going to take up all the air. I do want to welcome one of my leading volunteers, Susan Sparling. She is on the chat with us and will have a few moments to share her perspective of working with plant records. So this is our quick agenda for the day. We're going to do some introductions just to let you get to know Susan and myself a little bit better, and to talk briefly about who are plant record curators. We're going to move on to a quick review of the definitions of a botanical garden and how living collection policy fit in with that. Moving on finally to living collection policy, some of the examples from our organization and some of the ways that we are able to communicate collections policy information to staff, volunteers, and other stakeholders. And finally, at the end, spend a little bit more time on making sure we're all talking about the resources that we need to get living collection management work done, including a CAP assessment, which I'll talk at length about, recruiting help, and ARDNet and ESRI partnerships. I wanted to show off some of the icons you'll see throughout the presentation. If you're on a phone, you can use the QR code to get to the websites related to the information. You're also a hyperlink for people who review the slides later. And then some engaging action icons. So if there's a great opportunity, I think, for you all to share in the chat, you can see the little chat bubbles. If it has a paperclip, that means I will be giving you the resources to share them. So hopefully you can use them for your own organization. And you see there's also a polling icon. Finally, if I have learned anything, it's how to share customized features in IrisBG and figure out how to make the software better for us. So if I have a little tip, I'll put that in a little tip icon as well. So keep your eyes out peeled for those. And a quick introduction. Again, I'm Laurel Hill, and Susan Sparling is on the line with us. And this is a picture of an exciting spot I found at the garden where someone was reading signage in a very engaged way. And I thought that worth documenting for all time. Quickly about me, I was hired on as a horticulturist over 10 years here at the garden. So I have a bachelor's in horticulture from Virginia Tech, a master's in teaching, and I wanted to work with plants. So when we had a greenhouse, a horticulturist position opened up, I jumped on it. And that's where I started to learn about plant records as we were transitioning our orchid information over into IrisBG for the first time. So I did a lot of data work then and scrubbing it for import. But outside of that, I was only focused on orchid accessioning and records. So I done that for about 10 years cumulatively. And then in June 2020, moved over to plant records for the garden full time. So out of all the sort of tasks that I've started doing, I was a horticulturist and a tractor driver and a shovel operator. And on the right, I've sort of started cataloging the kinds of tasks that I end up doing now. All of my learning about plant records is on the job. It's through networking, it's through communities like you all. And so I find that engagement of the community to be really valuable to someone like me who started off in plants and is now moving on to plant records. So I'm sorry, my little check marks got goofed up. I haven't written a grant yet. So if you are a grant writing specialist, I need to learn from you. And if you do anything outside of these tasks, please feel free to drop them in the chat. This is your chance to brag on the kind of work you are doing. So Lewis Ginter Botanical Garden is really a garden with something for everyone. We're 50 cultivated acres in Richmond, Virginia. We have big plans to expand into a second site and another property. We do have a wide variety of educational opportunities for youth and family and adults. Classical domed conservatory, which, as we know, looks great from afar, but is troublesome maintenance-wise close up. We have a brand new exhibit called Encanto and an oasis of lyrical sculpture that has just opened up, so that's very exciting. Our plant collections have only been growing for 40 years. And exciting for us, a living collections policy, the last revision was in April 2021, and that was only the 5th in our 40-year history. And finally, we have a disaster plan, our first in our history that was signed in September of 2021. So my first poll question to you all is about the age of your last living collection policy. And the question is, when was your living collection policy last renewed? In the past year, within 1 to 3 years, 4 to 10 years, or 10 plus years ago? And when I started as a plant records curator, our living collection policy was about 9 years old. I'm not glad that 30% of you all seem to not have a signed and adopted policy yet, because it makes your work a little bit harder to wrangle, but I am glad you're here. So maybe some of the resources you get today will help you get that adopted if that's what your organization wants to do. Great. Thank you so much for that. So we have over 50% whose policy either does not exist or is over 4 years old. So that's really interesting. All right. So thank you for participating in that. I think that's informative to me for sure. So this slide just really takes us back to what a botanical garden is designed to be and how they are defined. The Botanic Gardens Conservation International on their website, which is linked and QR coded, just says that we are institutions holding documented collections of living plants for very specific purposes: research, conservation, display, and education. Timothy Hone, I hope I'm saying that right, authored what I believe is our guiding book here at the Garden, Curatorial Practices for Botanical Gardens. The most recent version is out, second edition. I find it to be a great and valuable resource. But he lists that we are a permanent institution for the purpose of acquiring, preserving, researching, and interpreting to the public for its instruction and enjoyment plants of specific types of value. And that collecting and collections are the heart and soul of the Botanic Garden's purpose to save, understand, and interpret plants. I bring these quotes up to the forefront because throughout this conversation, my argument is really that it's more than plant records, it's living collection management, and it's a core concept of being a part of a botanical garden. And the garden strategic plan itself lists that our aim, our aspiration is to become a national place of horticultural and educational excellence through the development of our living collections as it relates to our core values. The APGA, the American Public Gardens Association, has 5 accepted criteria. Now, we are not a certified botanic garden by the BGCI, but we do adhere to these accepted criteria. On the left is the 5 criteria as they're listed on the APGA's website. They're open to the public on at least a part-time basis. They function as an aesthetic, educational, or research site. They maintain plant records, that the garden has at least 1 staff member, and visitors can identify plants through labels, maps, or interpretive materials. So I took that list and I reframed it in what I believe is a hierarchy with maintains plant records sort of augmented to say that a living collection management program and policy is foundational for the other criteria of being a public garden. So I mentioned that Lewis Ginter Botanical Gardens is 40 years old, give or take. And this is a quick timeline of our living collections and some of the keystone moments in our program. So you see we started accepting plant material in 1984. We've had a collection policy signed in 98, 2000, 05, 2012, and then 2021. This last version was significantly enhanced and reviewed. So the previous 3 were sort of re-signing on the same concepts. This last version, the one that I'll share with you today, has some more meat to it than the previous versions did. We had a map, a museum assessment back in 1999, but no formal collections program assessment until the CAP program this past year, Collections Assessment for Preservation. We'll talk more about that later on in the slide. I wanted to also share with you the idea that we've only had a full-time paid records curator on staff for just shy of 8 of our 40 years. Those are indicated by the purple rectangles that you see. Outside of those years of paid staff members full-time, I would like to share that we've had some volunteers and staff members who have really put their heart and soul into plant records on a collateral basis as they were able to do. This included new volunteers, librarians, horticulturists, director of horticulture, and you can imagine it, despite their best efforts, it's a priority thing for people who are not able to do this full time every day. So we were great. We have great records and great passionate people, and we just need more resources. Our software, our information about our plant records has changed hands at least 4 times that I was able to find. We finally settled into IrisBG in 2014, 2015, and have been building that program ever since, learning along the way. We have an embosser, most recently a Matica C330 that we purchased in the early 20s for our embossed metal tags. And we are still using a rotary engraver, and we make our labels in-house. Our GIS, Geographic Information System program, is very young. In 2016, we had an intern do some mapping with a rented GNSS receiver. In 2020, I learned how to click and drag GPS point using a base map in IrisBG, and that's how we started. We adopted Floria to try and do some field work, and we're moving into the Esri ArcGIS world. It's a brief history of living collections, plant records here at the garden. And even though I love our new policy from 2021, it's not enough to write it. It's not enough to get it signed. Have to communicate it broadly. So my next poll question to you is, in general, how aware are your organization's members of living collections, policy, procedures, concepts, and goals? And this is a really broad question, but if you think they're extremely aware, very aware, moderately aware, slightly aware, or perhaps not at all aware. From our point of view, since COVID, we've had a significant amount of staff and volunteer turnover. And as I mentioned to you, I knew almost nothing about living collection management when I joined the garden 10.5 years ago. And so it's also my understanding and empathy with people who start working at a botanical garden passionately, but just don't have the knowledge of collections management yet. Thank you for that. That sort of aligned with what I think that we are here as a staff and volunteer organization. And so the next part of my slide, we'll talk about who needs to know about the policy and how can we communicate that. And these are just some action items that I've been able to take in my job here. And it boils down to talk to as many people as you can in as many avenues as you can, as often as they'll listen. So when we signed it, we emailed it out to the organization. I requested that it be posted as a primary document on our staff intranet dashboard. We're on Teams, so I wrote a wiki for all of our new team members to review, and I incorporated that into their new staff onboarding. We have it published to our volunteer homepage we call VicNet. It's inserted into a new volunteer training slide deck. We have created a new position in our Bloomingdale Council, which is a liaising committee between hort staff, the garden staff, and our volunteers throughout the department. So we insert a report into that meeting. I printed IrisBG tip that I didn't learn until a couple years ago is print annual accessions catalogs, and you can disseminate that out. So I have the sort of how to do that up in our IrisBG tip. And finally, what we're going to talk about next is I understand people don't want to read a policy document. They don't want to refer to it a lot. So I've tried to boil that essential information down into some one-pagers that I have posted and shared. And I will share with you those at the end and throughout the presentation. Here's one of my first examples of a simplified one-pager. On the left, you see a D.A. Roberts' document system chart of activities, processes, and stages from 1984, as is found in Hone's book. Granted, a lot of people that I work with might not enjoy diving down into this document. So I tried my best to pull out the essential information from that and turn it into our simple systems chart. This was one of the action items recommended by our CAP assessor. But what I find interesting is this, even the vocabulary that I've pulled is not perfectly accessible. The idea of a desiderata is not common sense language to people. So in future versions, I will just put wish list. Make it as simple, as palatable as possible to communicate it. It does have the 5 stages. So it has the pre-entry stage and the items that should be occurring at those stages, an entry stage, the accession stage, the registration stage, and the catalog stage. What I find to be really interesting is the meat of a good plant record, in my opinion, happens down in the documentation process. And that's where we can get a lot of information loaded into IrisBG that can be shared with our staff, volunteers, and guests. So there'll be a Word version of this document available to you that is editable for your purposes. Here's another one, another simplified one-pager. In our living collections policy, we have framed core collections as our primary plant choosing criteria. It's a pretty broad list. If a horticulturist wants a certain type of plant, they can probably find a way to make it fit into one of these core collections or the selection criteria. The point of these types of documents and criteria are to make us think through receiving plant material, make sure they align with our collection's goals and our organizational mission. So we have display collections, stewardship collections, plant taxa of focus, legacy collections, ethnobotanical collections, historic collections, and natural areas. These are so broad, but they are where we want to remind ourselves as a department to focus our attention. And then to the right is another type of selection criteria that encourages plant purchasers to think through the value that this plant material will have as far as horticulturally interesting or aesthetic or special. If they have ecosystem services for our property, they have conservatory display value. If they provide educational opportunities, or are of collaborative or research interest. So one tip I've learned through these coffee chats is to find a way to relate these core collections and criteria, if so desired, through custom themes based on your collections. And you can do that through the code list theme types. Another simplified one-pager is this idea of a records workflow. This is designed to sort of echo the previous structural systems chart, but in a more specific who does what and when and why kind of way. So it goes before the plants are ordered. We want our ordering horticulturist to review the collections policy, to secure approval, to make notes and communicate why we're getting this plant and where it's supposed to be going. When they're received, they have to sign off. They have to inspect and confirm both the tax and the quantity received. This is so that I am not accessioning material based on a packing slip that is not actually the amount of plants we received. That they make notes on their shipping invoice with the tax set and quantities checked off, the name of staff, because I use that name in the record, who received it, the date of delivery and receipt, that they give a copy to the ordering horticulturist and the plant records curator. When the plants are received, I'm declaring this is what I'm going to do next as your plant records curator. I write the purchase order and submit it to finance. This is something relatively new for our organization, but I think it's valuable because that gives me what I need to add a source documentation to the IrisBG record. I then accession the plant material, and also new in the past year is that I insist on accessioning everything as received to the greenhouse, item number 1. I will put a temporary accession tag on the plant at that time. And then I also digitize a final copy of the invoice. I share it in a location on our shared drive that anybody can access. And then I also put a record in IrisBG as a library item. So when a horticulturist goes to the greenhouse to take some plants, their job then is to write me a accession update request telling me what they took and when and how many and where they put it. And I've tried really hard to make this a flexible process for them. I mentioned that we're on Teams. So from the field, they can send me an accession update request just by a Teams message. I'll get that, take action on it, and follow up with any questions I might have. They can also, if they prefer paper, I also have a paper form that they can use. What I don't like are emails because they get buried in emails. So we've had to transition from sort of an email way to either Teams, which stays live and current, or a paper document that I can handle. And then finally, when I receive that update request, I go ahead. At that point, I will give them an engraved display label, which we also have accession numbers on. And then the hort should install them. When that happens, we will send out either volunteers or myself to go find the plant and do that collection work that I mentioned before to give it a location of an accession item, photograph it, and add other documents as time allows. So that's kind of our process. I know I read through it a lot. I'm happy to answer any questions or let you guys talk about what you do differently or any suggestions you might have. But really, the idea of an accession item and how we run through accession items is conveyed to the right, partly because I needed to teach other people how an accession item works. What is an accession number? How do I break an accession up into item numbers, and why? So it's a little pictograph that I made to try and help them understand how the record gets built over time. So we talked about all this data collection, all these processes, and it really boils down to we're building what I think is an ideal or goal-setting plant record. And I feel over this time there are 3 kind of ways people would see a plant record. And this one, public-facing, on-site, in the garden, is probably our top priority. It's where people learn about the plants in a really engaged way, but also our guests just want to know what the name of a plant is. So the other types are our public-facing on-site and our back of the house full IrisBG plant record. And we'll talk a little bit about those that follow. So basic labeling goals at this time for each accession item is a display label for our permanent living collections that has an accession number directly on it. I know that there's the idea of a tag, a metal tag also, but for us right now, we are committing our living collections. They get their own tag, display label, engraved in-house with an accession number. And if you wanted to customize your labels or your content, you can do that to the IrisBG tip that you see. So bottom line, I think people come to the garden, they just want this. They don't necessarily care much else. And you can see I also have a label that shows the content of our labels. And I use this as an educational opportunity for other people when I have to explain what's on a label and why. So if you have something above and beyond, please share that in the chat. Let us know what you wish you had as a basic label for each of your accession items. The idea that it could be better with interpretive content, thematic education, QR codes, different languages, augmented reality has even come up. Those following 5 ideas, they're really organizationally driven, resource dependent, capacity limited, and need to be collaborative. So it's not something I have the power to execute myself, although I'm ready to assist in those efforts if somebody wanted that project. It's outside of my scope, but I think ideal if we had more interpretation out in the garden. So beyond being in the garden, looking at a plant label, we do try and really beef up our public-facing online plant records. So I want these to be a little bit enriched, educational, and visual. So we have the same accession number and full taxon name goals, plus a GPS map point, photographs, and hyperlinks. I really leaned into the hyperlinks for both an academic level and your basic extension home gardener level information. I've been able to use volunteers to help with a lot of this research. All I had to do really is teach them how and reinforce that skill and created a custom web link. So I have, 15 web links preloaded in IrisBG, and I've coded them with a number. So that way I can say to my volunteers, I want for this species, I want you to use 2 number 1 web links. These would be my really academic, rich, scientific web links. Get me at least 2 of those. Give me 2 of my extension levels, which I have a different code for, and yada, yada. So that's been a really useful way to convey to volunteers who are helping what I'm hoping to get into one of these online public-facing records. So we lean also on the International Cultivar Registry authorities whenever possible, and we have a list of those as well in IrisBG. I also include Google Patents because I think getting to the bottom of a patent record is valuable and informative to guests who are looking at plants online. And then also better if I could get interpretive content, tours, or a custom map, which I'm working on in the long term. Here's an example of an ideal public-facing online record on our Garden Explorer page. I like this record because you can see it has a lot of those components that we are hoping to provide our online guests with. And brand new, very excited, I had a proof of concept to digitize some of our garden's herbarium specimens. And you can see I also added that to this record as well. So if you flip through the pictures of this record online, you can see an herbarium specimen, which I think is really neat. And that was just me playing around, learning something new about IrisBG a couple weeks, literally weeks ago. So most people don't see this part of a plant record, but this is where my volunteers and I spend a lot of time. And this is in the ideal IrisBG accession record from our point of view. There's so much we can do with the software, but we have to sort of limit it down to things that we are actually able to accomplish and do that consistently. So you can see, I will show you my sample next, but these are some of the things we want in the back end. We want it to be a complete, current, and integrated, if possible, collection. So all the way down to contact information, taxon references, material information, item history. Hopefully we've seen and said something about the item within 5 years. Bed code, label type and status, a GPS map point, photographs, and source documentation. Again, this is something we started in 2023 and we went back a couple years. This was inspired by a coffee chat, which is to get these source documents uploaded and linked to an accession record as library items. We were able to customize the names and types of our library items through the definitions, code lists, and library item type. Following is one of the accession. This is a rarity. So I'm showing you one of my unicorns because not all of our records are like this. But this has a complete current and pretty integrated record. You can see here on the items tab, you can see we planted in 87 and we've gone back and added information within the past 3 years, really recently. We have images, which you can see to the far right of my screen. We have references, which you can see here. This is a digitized early plant record card from the 80s, which we've had volunteers go through and digitize so that we can get them added. And then if there was an event or task related to it, we could have added that on the events page here. So this is a kind of a B minus, B plus record for me. I mean, there's a lot of what we are hoping to have in this record. Again, all of our records aren't like this yet. But if there was an herbarium specimen, a funding code, or an MOU, we would add that. So I've talked for a while. We're going to get into some other beefy stuff after a poll. This is the section of the presentation where we're going to talk about the resources that you think you need to get living collection management and plant records done at your organization. And I want to hear how many people have everything you need to get the job done. People who are have most of what you need. People who feel under-resourced, and if you share in the chat, things that you still need or want. And while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and keep talking about some thoughts about how we can get the things that we need if we don't have them. And this is just from me being a squeaky wheel plant records curator. To keep your work and time a visible and protected priority, it seems to me as a horticulturist, in the face of display, bedding, change out, plants dying, things needing water, and pest plant records isn't always a priority, but I try and protect it as a priority. I frequently ask for help and advice when I can, offer suggestions that are relevant and helpful. I reference the living collections policy frequently. I pitch ideas, demonstrate use cases, and we're going to get into these final three: leverage collections, assessment for preservation program, ARBNet, and ArcGIS. So I'm so happy that over 50% of you have most of what you need to get the job done. That is excellent. I think when I started, I didn't. By now, 3 years into it, I do have most of what I need. And I have organizational support, which I feel is pretty important. Okay, so we're going to dive into the collections assessment for preservation program. If any of you have a CAP assessment or similar type of collections assessment, please talk about it in the chat. I'll briefly run through the CAP. Here is administered by the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation in agreement with the IMLS. The goal is to provide small to medium organizations partial funding, match funding, for a conservation assessment. You'll facilitate a study of the institutional collections, buildings and systems, policies and procedures. And why do we do all of this? It's so that we get a report from professionals with prioritized recommendations that can be used as a tool to secure projects, resources, grants, and funding. Okay, briefly run through our CAP timeline. This was led by our library and archives manager. Quite frankly, I just grabbed on the coattails to get any leverage I could out of a living collections assessment. But we have a lot of non-living collections and buildings that house those collections. And so we were really grateful for our library and archives manager to spearhead this. We were accepted in November 2021 and worked to set up the on-site assessment that happened at the end of April. We had two assessors, one that focused on our buildings. We had three buildings that were under the scope of this, and our collections that included everything from rare books to living collections. We received our final report back in September, and we are currently in a working group execute some of the recommendations process now with two grants outstanding. So this was our final report included the very detailed and thorough report. It looked at every, you left no sculpture unturned. No herbarium cabinet door wasn't opened. They went on top of the conservatory buildings, down in the rare book collection, and looked at every nut and bolt. So it was a very thorough assessment based on what we applied for. You can focus on buildings or collections or living collections if in your assessment. So again, you can see that we received intermediate, short-term, long-term recommendations. They don't all have to be followed. They're just recommendations. Our education center, conservatory, and greenhouse that house our collections were under the scope of this. And the collections assessment went through all of these different types of collections. Down here is where living collections live. That includes our conservatory collections. Okay, this is just the excerpt of our CAP report as it relates to living collections themselves. So they had a lot of advice for us, which we appreciated. This wasn't the time to hide anything or cover up anything. We were asked to put it all out on the table, our resources, our restrictions, our problems, concerns. And they sussed all that out, and these were our living collections recommendations. I've gone ahead and coded them. Some of these we already had in progress pre-CAP, but it's good to see it in writing so that we can sort of reference this and use it to get resources and prioritize our work. A couple of them we declined to implement immediately. They didn't fit in with our processes. For example, down in number 6, it was recommended we started labeling our trees and shrubs directly onto the plant material. This would have required us to change our processes, get pre-drilled holes, get new tools, and we were still in the middle of doing a tree and shrub inspections. So we just declined that out of consensus in our department for now. And you can see some we did go forward and move and try and accomplish. And that's where number 3 here on the left, a lot of that workflow documentation came from. ARBNet application came from that as well. And then continued to reprioritize the inventory. We don't have time. Here's this one, hire a new part-time conservatory plant curator. We didn't get funding to hire another half me or another half somebody else. So we weren't able to move forward with that. But these are the kind of recommendations we received. Non-living collections and buildings have their own set of to-do items that they've been able to work on. Throughout this whole process, though, this is one of the take-homes is we need more help to get the work done. And this is something I've known since day one. And so we've tried to recruit paid horticulture staff to help as they're able. We also use college students through a federal work study program. We're an off-site employer for a federal work study student here at VCU. We've had a couple of those here in the library and also in living collection. We also have service learning classes. We can use students and interns, but really the meat of the extra help for plant records comes out of our volunteer force. And we have volunteers in plant records that we would call field volunteers, data entry or research volunteers. And if they can do more than one and be a triple threat, that's great. If they only want to do one part, I find a way to engage them and help with plant records. So you can see some pictures of some of the people, volunteers, staff, and interns out doing the various types of work. And to the top right, Susan Sparling is one of a volunteer that's almost 3 years who has done most everything you can do in plant records. And I've invited her to join us to share her volunteer perspective working with plant records. So Susan, if you want to jump in and talk a little bit about yourself and the work you do.
Hello, I'm Susan Sparling. I've been volunteering with the garden since January of 2019, right after I retired. I was a librarian at the local public library system. We had 10 branches. I was assistant to the system administrator, working with their database and managing it. I was webmaster. I was a reference librarian. I was on multiple committees. And so working in the garden was wonderful. I wasn't missing meetings, but I was missing working with databases and spreadsheets. I have limited time on IrisBG, only a few hours a week, most weeks. And it would be interesting if I could spend more time, but I'm enjoying being a retiree and not wanting to commit too much. But I love getting to the garden and walking around and taking pictures. When I started with the garden, I worked for IT and helped gather information and create a database of all computers on the campus. I scrubbed database records for the garden shop. And in the library, I helped prepare for a transition to their new ILS. In living collections, I started with doing some research and scrubbing spreadsheet records for possible import, verifying plant names, learning about taxa, and learning how to work in IrisBG. Given that it wasn't an everyday, let alone every week chore, I didn't pick up on Iris as quickly as I may have, but I'm feeling pretty comfortable now. And having been a reference librarian, I recognize the most reliable sources when I'm doing research. And so for me, I sometimes just do a Google search, scroll through quickly and grab what I need that way rather than having to refer back to a list of the resources. I wouldn't recommend it for everybody though. Laurel, next screen. So my entry point into plant records was no horticultural or botanical knowledge, none. And even without any formal training, I recognize patterns. I can easily see when something is amiss in what I'm cleaning up. The very tests that Laurel has given me and the timing of them has given me a good knowledge and comfort in using IrisBG. And back to you, Laurel.
Thank you, and thanks for all the work you do.
And those are some of my photos from over the years. I love the garden in winter.
Yeah,
and these are some early in the year photos.
Perfect. Thank you so much. What I think is interesting is that really exemplary volunteers for this kind of work like Susan don't have to know plants. They don't have to know plants at all. They have to have an attention to detail. And I love Susan for that. I love when people can find my typos. I really need that help. So, and she's been willing to learn everything. Susan's on Teams now. And also we've done a lot of sharing and work through Teams, IrisBG, our databases, spreadsheets and everything. So that kind of help is really valuable. Moving on a little bit quickly through ARBNet. So if you don't know or aren't ARBNet certified yet, it is a program administered through Morton Arboretum. And it establishes and shares a set of industry standards for the purpose of unifying the Arboretum community, botanical gardens included in this, but they focus on woodies and trees. It's a free volunteer accreditation for Arboretum worldwide. It's based on organization's self-assessment and self-reporting. And the garden first received its accreditation as a level 2 back at the beginning of the year. It can sound like a daunting application or process, but the work that was done from 2020 to 2022, the end of 2022, set us up to quickly and easily, for the most part, complete this application, and the turnaround was really quick. I bring this up after the CAP just to encourage organizations to to apply for a certification like this. The lowest level, you only need 25 different taxa, and they have some other requirements that you can see through the QR code and online. We learn a lot and are challenged organizationally by going through these processes. So it was a good growth opportunity for us. I will attach the full application so you can read through it. You can see the components of it and some of the paragraphs that we submitted as well. And again, we just called our collections at the time a well-rounded representation of woody plant material with landscape value, conservation potential, regional nativity, and or educational use. And then I highlighted some of these taxa groups in the application. So our net was a great exercise, also came out of our CAP program. The last thing I'm going to mention really quickly before we run out of time is the idea of moving into the Esri suite of products. People know this as ArcGIS Online, ArcGIS Desktop Pro, and related apps. Their nonprofit program provides any qualified nonprofit with an affordable way to acquire Esri solutions. It's a very low cost given what tools you will receive, the simple application and review. We applied for our membership in December of 2020 and really started using it within the past year and a half. It's only $100 a year for ArcGIS Desktop Pro package, and you can learn more with the links I provided. On the bottom, you can see 3 different types of projects that I have started and implemented. And I'll focus here on this one. This one was the one that Sue's helped. As far as getting the tools you need, I think this is a great visual way to convey the amount of work still left to do. Each one of these points is either a azalea, iris, or peony plant that's blooming this spring without a proper label. That's a lot of points. That's a lot of work. And if I just said there's a lot of work to do, it's not quite as visual as saying I need to revisit all 188 of these dots because the labels have been lost, but before I can relabel it, I need to collect the bloom information and really solve this puzzle, because you can't just put a label on something that doesn't have a name yet. You have to re-identify it and solve the puzzle before you can get a label on it. And the other great program, this is a super easy entry into creating a detailed story map. So it links in with Garden Explorer pretty well. So having said all of that, we have just a few minutes left. I want to wish you all luck with your Living Collections Management program and ask that you please keep in touch. If you have questions, suggestions, or resources, you can visit the garden online. Please visit me and Susan in person. Drop us a line, phone, or email. Chat on APGA. And keep posting on the IrisBG community forum. Thank you. You'll learn a lot through the resources and attachments we're going to get you after this presentation. But if you run into any questions, comments, or concerns, please reach out. Wish you luck. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Susan, for joining us, and IrisBG for having us today.
Thank you so much, Laurel. That was fantastic. And thank you, Susan, for giving us your perspective. This was really a helpful presentation.